So I'm going to talk about connecting with others. When I was asked to give this talk, I actually wasn't so aware that the general theme of the weekend would be focusing on awareness. So my awareness of the awareness was a bit absent. What immediately came up for me when I thought about connecting with others was communication. So basically I'm going to talk about communication and the art of communication. And really, thinking about how the weekend has been conducted, I think what I'm doing in a way is starting to, so far we've been looking at these separate, these kinds of awareness, mindfulness of self, mindfulness of other, mindfulness of the world, and mindfulness of reality, the sort of separate categories. But when you start engaging with people, when you start engaging with what's going on, all these things come into play at once. So they're not really separate. There's a sort of dynamic flow of these different dimensions of the awareness that's a bit like a dance. There's a kind of process of feedback and response. And the way we handle that dynamic flow is going to make a big difference to how well we're able to make those connections. If we don't handle the feedback well, we can respond in a way that is destructive or undermining. If we handle it well, we can treat things in a way that the effect is to be affirming, reinforcing, and creative. So this is all a bit complex, put that way. But actually, in Buddhism, we've got some very useful tools. We've got the precepts, which Bodhinaga was mentioning. In particular, we have the speech precepts. One of the things I must say, I find when we chant the 5 precepts, the truth precept is said to encapsulate all the speech precepts together. I find that very unsatisfactory. And I know that what I want to do, what I want to say to people, actually, if you want to practice the speech precepts, if you want to practice speaking skillfully to people, you really need to engage and look at the 4 speech precepts that we take when we get ordained. And they're very well written out here. Sangha has written the 10 Pillars of Buddhism. It's basically an exposition of the 10 precepts that we take at ordination. But I think anyone practicing as a Buddhist really ought to read this and particularly look at the speech precepts. I think they're really important. And I think as soon as you take up Buddhism, it will be a really good idea to read the sections on the speech precepts. And when we chant the truth precept with the 5 precepts, just see that as a kind of code for the 4. So the 4, just to remind you, if you don't know already, well, there is truthful speech, of course. There's helpful speech. There's kindly speech, and there's harmonious speech. I'm actually not going to say much more about it than that because I referred you to this book. It's such a long, I think we've got several weekends of retreat that we could explore these themes. So I needed to think of a way of sort of narrowing it all down. So I thought the best way was basically to skip over these and just refer you to Bhante. Then I can go home, really, if I run out of time. One of the things I found very interesting is that communication is not just about speech. Vidanya referred to that yesterday. He referred to the importance of what's called non-verbal communication. And for me, the reference point and a real eye-opening experience was a period that I spent, 10 years ago to this day, I spent a 6-week period door knocking for a charity, for the Karuna Appeal, that is one of the projects of what was then the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, now the Triratna movement. And basically involved simply going around and knocking on strangers' doors and asking them to contribute money on a regular basis to support people in India. And this was a real challenge of meeting strangers and connecting with others. And from that, there were a few lessons that I got that struck home very, very forcibly, over and above the speech precepts, as we tend to think of them. And the first one was indeed this question of being aware of the importance of non-verbal content. So there's posture, there's how you stand. And one of the things that I tended to do when I was first door knocking was stand too close. So what would happen is that someone would open the door and I'd be sort of in their face. Now this is quite a culturally kind of contextually bound thing, because you can be with people from other countries who habitually stand quite close. And I've actually got quite a good friend who's of Turkish origin. And I'm always a bit uncomfortable around him because he's right close to me. I mean, he's a lovely guy and I really enjoy talking to him. But there's this sort of bit of me that doesn't really feel comfortable. So we have to be aware simply of our posture. Also, the stance we take. I experimented over the 6 weeks. I'm not quite sure how effective it was. It wasn't always easy to tell the impact it had. With how I stood, you can stand in an aggressive way, you know, with your kind of like this. And people are going to back off, they're not going to want to engage with you. What I tried to do was adopt a more sort of relaxed stance. And I'm not sure if it was a bit forced, you know, but I think the idea, the sort of thing I kind of worked on was perhaps standing a little bit sideways, so I'm not directly challenging people, so you know, they're not threatened, and kind of trying to, you know, trying to relax, which was difficult, because particularly to begin with, I was really, really nervous. And then, of course, there's the tone that you use too. That's very important. I think we often forget how important the tone of our voice communicates what's going on. And often at quite a basic, even a sort of animal level, I think. And the thing is that we react to that as well, quite unconsciously very often. We react to tones without quite realising it. I had a really good illustration of that. I must have been, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago. I was on a bus in London, and there were 2 guys talking to each other. They were pretty rough characters. I got the impression that maybe they'd been or were homeless. You know, they'd obviously had quite a rough lives. But they were talking about racism. I think one of them was of mixed race, and the other one was the white guy. And they were talking about, I can't actually remember what the details were, but what I thought was good was that they were talking about something that seemed quite ethical, and what they were saying was quite ethical to my mind. It was, you know, I felt that's right on, you know, keep it up. And they were in agreement. But the tones that they were adopting to each other were quite argumentative and even a bit aggressive. They were kind of they're kind of, the speech that they adopted tended to have phrases in it, yeah, but, in a quite forceful kind of way. So it was a bit like they were sort of unconsciously saying, I think you're wrong here. And because it was quite an emotionally charged subject, they became quite emotionally charged. And actually, after about 10 minutes, even though they were in agreement, I actually thought they might even come to blows. It was very, very strange. It was very strange to listen to this, but quite a good lesson. And perhaps another thing about non-verbal communication is that because it's so often very unconscious, it's difficult to know that we're actually what we're communicating. Sometimes we know that for some reason people just react badly to us. But I think this is where friends can be really, really helpful. Good friends who can kind of feed back to you the kind of signals that you're giving out. Even though, I mean, I find all this very uncomfortable to receive. Because it's actually quite difficult to manage your tone, you know, to manage the non-content of your voice is not an easy thing to do necessarily. And so to get feedback about that, it's a bit like, what am I going to do about it? You know, it's a bit like you're kind of lost to begin with. But I think it's really important because I've seen so many situations where things have gone wrong. I've been involved in situations where things have gone wrong because just simply because the tone didn't quite strike the right chord. So the other thing that I particularly learned about communication with others was simply not communicating, or rather silence, not speaking. Because I was so nervous when I knocked on those doors, we were prepared with a speech, a kind of things that we wanted to say to get across, to get people to think about what we were doing. We were inviting them to read a leaflet and then to come back I would come back and then ask if they were interested. And to do that, you kind of cultivated a certain kind of spiel to get you kind of going. And what would happen is that people would open the door, and then immediately I'd launch into my spiel. So it's a bit like they were kind of flooded with me, with what I wanted to get across. And someone pointed out to me, I think it was Jayaraja, he said, what's happening is that, people are opening the doors of their house. This is their territory, if you like. And you're forcing yourself into their space. And he said, what you need to do is pause. You need to pause and let them feel that they've got the initiative. They need to have the initiative, so they need that space. I had to practice really, really hard at this. I really had to count, when the door would open and I'd have to go internally, 1, 2, 3. And really sort of allow what felt to me like a really uncomfortable extended space to take place before I could really sort of get this working. But it was such a strong lesson because, my own my own anxiety, my own neurosis, if you like, the me bit, was so keen to get in there. It really felt horrid with it. That space was truly painful. But that was what was needed to kind of reassure the other person that I wasn't going to, I wasn't basically assaulting them. And they were put at their ease, and they were able to say what they wanted to say. They weren't being pressured in some kind of way. And I think this experience has got me reflecting an awful lot on the importance of in communication, the importance of silence, the importance of not speaking, the importance of listening. And I could go on for a long time about that, but I don't think I've got enough time. I forgot to look what time I started. So I think I'm just thinking of my own ways in which I have had to learn how to kind of allow, I've had to hold back from speaking, apart from the stepping in on the door knocking. I find in groups, quite often I get keen on my ideas about whatever we're talking about, particularly if I feel, engaged with it, and I feel I value the kind of the subject matter. I want to jump in with what I've got to say. I know when I'm on the receiving end of that, it's actually quite uncomfortable. Sometimes I've had to learn to let people finish what they're saying, for example. But I know that when people jump in, when I'm sort of speaking, there's an element of aggression in that. It sort of stops you. It's a bit like, I find that as if they're saying, well, okay, we've heard enough of you. It's my turn now. And I'm sort of thinking, well, actually, I haven't quite rounded off what I wanted to say. And I think it's quite important to let people finish what they're saying before you kind of have your say. More importantly, and I think this is related to depth, actually, that Bodhinaga was talking about, I think that space, that silence, allows for more depth. Just simply having a quiet space allows for more depth. One of the practices in chapters that we've been doing for a number of years now, I think on the initiative of Subhuti particularly, was this idea of speaking from silence. So that you just sit and don't speak until you feel moved to speak. And speaking from the silence, I think allows you to connect much more with what's deeper, what's more important. And I think I've found that it, not only that, and maybe it's strongly connected to that, I think it also allows for more creativity. I think, again, in group situations, if there's a silence, then when people speak from that, it's a bit like you can take it in and you can let go a little bit of your own ideas, and you can kind of see them in a more, there's a more sort of holistic view of the subject matter that you're kind of wrestling with or working with, rather than what your particular view is and take on things. How much more time? That's it. Okay, good. Well, that's good. Those are the important things I've got said. So, I want to kind of round off by saying that I think that for me, I mean, this is true of all the precepts actually, but it's particularly true of communication. And I think this is, I hope this is a thread that you've seen running through what I've been saying. And it's a very important part of the whole the whole way of seeing things. There's this sort of dynamic kind of dance that goes on, the flow of conditions really, is that it isn't really about being right or wrong, or being good or bad. What it really is about appropriateness. So it's about sort of context-specific situations. So in the example of the cultural closeness, you know, in some cultures it's appropriate to be close, and if you're not, people might feel that there's something wrong. In other cultures, you know, like our English culture, getting too close is kind of quite uncomfortable. And you have to be aware of that. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong, it's just simply that's how people respond. So appropriateness is kind of much more of an art form. It's much more about being aware of the specifics of the situation than any particularities which are universally held. The precepts, if you like, are values rather more than rules. I'll leave it there.